Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro Podcast. As usual, I'm your host, Jacob Shapiro, partner and director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Our scheduling's a little off because Rob is on vacation for the next 2 weeks. So this week, for our weekly update, we're welcoming Sim Tack back onto the podcast to talk about Ukraine's invasion of Russia. One little note, daycare is back and kids' birthday parties are back, which means the onslaught of head colds are back too. So I'm a little bit fuzzy today, as evidenced by the fact that at one point during the podcast, I said that Ukraine blew up state infrastructure of Germany in the North Sea, not the Baltic Sea, which was a funny little mishap. The idea of Ukraine and Scotland going to war over gas infrastructure, a funny little fictional aside. Anyway, thanks, Sim, for coming on the show. We will find somebody to pitch in for Rob next week, and then when he's back, we'll get back on our normal cadence. If you want to talk to me about any of the services that we offer at CI, we've been getting a lot of great engagement from listeners lately, both in terms of asks for some of our services or just wanting more information about what we do, or even suggestions about things that I should be checking out. So I appreciate it, and the door is open here. Jacob at cognitive.investments. Take care of the people that you love. Cheers, and see you out there. Sim, I can't remember the last time we talked. It's been a couple months, and I must say I was surprised. I was surprised at what Ukraine has done in the last couple of weeks, and so you were the first person I wanted to reach out to. First of all, how are you doing? Tell the listeners how your summer's been.
I'm doing well. Some of the attentive viewers, I guess, people that are watching this on video might notice I'm in a new background. So I've been moving from one place to another. A work in progress, as you can tell.
For those who can't see Sim, usually he has this background of books and weapons and all sorts of other things, and now we're just in a very bright retro attic looking thing with a very, very red wall. I think you're gonna have to do something about that.
That red wall is going to become very, very covered in books and shells, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I can see why you would want to cover that up. But let's get straight down into it. We've had a week or two to kind of digest what Ukraine is doing. So why don't we just start with the very most basic? What is it that Ukraine is actually doing on the ground, and how far have they gotten inside of Russia?
Well, I mean, in simple terms, what they've done is they've crossed the border with a significant amount of forces. So this is something different than the incursions into Russia that we've seen in the past, when we've seen primarily SBU and the so-called Russian Volunteer Corps cross the border into Russia for essentially temporary raids, right? Those raids were functional in kind of forcing Russia to maintain some level of presence on its border with Ukraine. Of course, it had a big symbolic value as well. The big difference with what's happening now is that we're seeing the Ukrainian army, so the actual ground forces, not the SBU, take the initiative here, and then they've committed multiple brigades to this operation. And I have to say, it actually looks like a pretty well thought out or conducted operation, which will lead me to some points that, some things I've talked about in the past that'll come up here again, but I'll stick with the brief description for now. But essentially, they crossed the border in the Kursk region, started to take over several villages where there was a very limited Russian presence, primarily FSB border guards, forces that were not really prepared to engage in a high intensity ground fight. So a lot of those forces actually surrendered, which we saw a lot of footage appearing of. And the Ukrainian forces continue to advance, and at this point, they've advanced past some of the initial smaller population centers in the Kursk region. They're nowhere near threatening to seize the city of Kursk, obviously, or even the entire Kursk region. So, we do need to be aware this is not like a massive conquest of Russian territory. Though the area in comparison is bigger than, for example, the areas that Russia recently seized in the Kharkiv region when it started its new front there. And I think what we're looking at now is that Ukraine has set its eyes on at least the territory south of the Same River, So the same is a river that runs west to east or east to west. It actually runs. And essentially there's only limited crossing points, 3 bridges that have already been destroyed, some pontoon bridges that the Russians have put in place that have been destroyed or targeted already. So they are very clearly trying to interdict Russian movement south of that river to essentially starve out the Russian forces remaining there and kind of grab that territory with the river as a natural barrier, I think.
When you say a significant sized force, how big are we talking? How big is the Ukrainian invasion force?
I mean, we are talking. It's not clear exactly how many forces there are. Of course, neither the Ukrainians, the Ukrainians aren't being very vocal about the exact force. The OSINT crowd has tried to piece together various units that are being spotted, but I'm sure that there are several units that we don't know of that are involved with as well. And then, of course, units that were spotted there, we don't know, are those the full brigades or battalions or only parts of them. But it looks like at this point we're looking at least like 4 to 5 full brigade-sized forces, if we're thinking of that in like Western equivalents of formations.
And this is a question that I've had since the beginning of the war, and which I still don't really have a good grasp on. Like, it makes sense to me that, Ukraine was punching on a weak spot on the Russian border where the Russians didn't necessarily have troops deployed. But the Russians do have air superiority, right? What was stopping the Russians from engaging these land assets with their air assets and stopping them in their tracks? Are the Ukrainians somehow deflecting that? Or are the Russians not? Do they not have air power in this part of the battlefield? Like, why were the Russians not able to mount any kind of response? I understand why they pushed first, but it's been going on weeks now and they haven't been able to do anything.
I mean, that's poking at a lot of separate issues when it comes to Russian air power, right? So you're making the statement that Russia has air superiority. So I'd say if we're talking about the numbers of assets that they have available, yes, by any means, the Russian Air Force is much larger than the Ukrainian Air Force, especially what remains of it or what is being rebuilt of it. But in terms of actual presence on the front line, we've seen the Russians have a lot of trouble to actually muster and concentrate that air power to have a significant effect on the front line. And then especially when it comes to the tactical application of air power, if you think back of the moments when people have been most vocal about the damage that Russian air power is doing, it has been in very static situation. It's been when the Russian Air Force has been launching the glide bombs at the static front lines over the past year and a half, right? Mm-hmm. So those kind of operations are very different in terms of preparation and target preparation than what would be required of the Russian Air Force right now in a very very dynamic situation. Mm-hmm. So as Ukrainians are moving around inside Russian territory, it's going to be difficult for the Russians to pin a target, get an air mission set up, and in the air coming to the target in time for it to actually still be relevant. And that's a problem that Russian air power has dealt with back in the Soviet days when the concept of tactical air controllers and things like that didn't really exist in the Russian military. Allegedly, now it is supposed to exist in this modern Russian army that they spent all that money on after 2000. But we've seen throughout the entire conflict that it's even though it might exist in some places, it's definitely not standard by any means.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, to use an American football analogy, I mean, it just feels like they're not doing the basic blocking and tackling, and it's remarkable to me that we're 2 years into this and they're still not doing the basic blocking and tackling.
Well, and to build on that, Ukraine also brought a very decent defensive line with it, and we've heard reports of a significant air defense presence supporting this offensive as well, which is one of the ways in which they actually seem to be doing this one right, and that they've brought the umbrella that those forces might need. And on top of that, I've actually also seen a couple videos that seem to imply Ukrainian air power itself is actually actively supporting forces on the ground inside Russia, which is a level of support that we haven't always seen in mobile Ukrainian operations either.
Well, that was the question I wanted to piggyback on, which is that we know that F-16s, I think the first ones were delivered or soon to be delivered, but as we've talked about here, it's going to take the Ukrainians a lot of time to get trained and to get up on it. But the deeper question is, do you think Ukraine's going to be able to do the sorts of things that Russia has not been able to do with its Air Force? Is that training going to allow them to be more flexible on the battlefield and to use air assets tactically? Or is it just they're going to get some shiny planes and it's going to take them a long time to be able to utilize them the way that we would expect a coherent military force to do so?
I think eventually we might see that. I wouldn't expect it in the short term or even for this specific operation that we're talking about. So Ukraine has indeed received the first F-16s. We've had visual confirmations of that. Several of the F-16s have been seen operating over Kherson. Based on the areas where they have been spotted and the loadouts that people have been able to spot in ground photos, as well as some of the videos where they're flying around, it looks like they are predominantly being used in an air defense role, which I think is kind of what everyone was expecting. It's probably the safest way to start to deploy these F-16s in a domain where they can still have a very big impact, right? That doesn't mean that they won't evolve over time, of course, towards things like air-to-ground strikes or close air support operations. But I think Ukraine will want to become a lot more comfortable with operating these F-16s and potentially have greater numbers before actually committing them to that.
That makes sense. Before we leave this part of the conversation, I just wanted to ask, one of the things that we've been hearing over and over for over 12 months now is that the Ukrainians are not getting enough ammunition. They're not getting enough artillery. They're not getting the weapons that they need. The soldier morale is declining, all these other sorts of things. And then they come and pull this off, which is why it was such a surprise to me. What do you read from that? Do you read from that they're getting more ammunition and that they felt that they could expend it? Were they so desperate to score some kind of moral victory that they punched in an area where they thought that they could square it up? Why help us understand how we get this narrative of they don't have enough of what they need and then suddenly they're running around Russian territory making the Russians look absolutely silly?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly how to gauge the level of ammunition shortages or availability at this point, because we know that supplies for artillery ammunition and other types of ammunition have been slowly ramping up again after the US Congress released a budget, but also as Europe has been ramping up production, as the Czech president has been able to start to get the ammunition coming through from his own ammunition buying program, I guess. So we know that those supplies should have been going up. So it makes sense in that regard that there might be more availability to support an operation like this. But then, as you say as well, like there is a level of desperation, not just stemming from the current situation on the battlefield, where apart from this operation in Kursk, most of the front is still pretty much deadlocked, and having something to show for at a critical time might prove to be very valuable for Ukraine as they are going into that very unknown period of U.S. elections. What will that do to U.S. support? What will that do to EU support? So I think on the whole, there's plenty of reasons for Ukraine to want to make a splash. That's not necessarily driven by the availability of ammo, for example.
Yeah. Okay. That leads us nicely into the second thing that I wanted to ask you, which is um, the big question is I want to get your sense of what Ukraine's objective is, because I have read a couple different things. I've heard that the objective is to relieve some of these other areas in eastern Ukraine, to try and get Russian forces to move from the fronts where it's not just stalemated, where Ukraine is slowly losing territory in the type of grinding conflict that Russia's going to do well in. I've read, well, this is actually about if there's a negotiation for some kind of peace settlement, now you can trade parts of occupied Russia for parts of occupied Ukraine. You're going to increase your bargaining position at the table, across the very, very long table for Mr. Putin. There's been, some reporting about how this area is where sort of the last entry point for Russian natural gas before it reaches European customers is. So if Ukraine can control that, it's part of a broader strategy to choke off or control Russian natural gas to Europe. And maybe we can get into the Nord Stream 2 story in the context of that as well. As an aside, I sort of imagine you hanging out in the same bar where they hatched this idea that they were going to go get a pleasure yacht and go blow up the Nord Stream pipeline. But anyway, and then you've also talked about the same river, which if you look at the map, and we'll post a link to a map in the show notes, you can see some really clear military objectives and about some of the transport lines and things like that Ukraine would want to cut off. So if we put it all aside, what do you think Ukraine's ultimate objective? And I know that there can be more than one objective; there can be secondary objectives. But what do you think will define success for Ukraine in this operation?
So, first off, let me take out that little gas infrastructure element where, like, I don't see that really being impacted by this operation, even if they take control of a piece of pipeline or distribution infrastructure on the Russian side of the border. There's always a part further upstream that Russia can shut down, right? So I don't. That doesn't really give Ukraine any additional control over that Russian gas that already flows through Ukraine. Now, when it comes to all of the other points, though, that's the very beauty of this kind of operation, is that it actually does enable a lot of potential objectives or outcomes, right? I'm not sure if any of them necessarily was put out front as they were planning that operation. I think it's completely viable that they were actually just looking at the fact that, hey, we have spare capacity here. We have reserve that is not committed. If we commit them, we could, achieve a number of things, which is, tying down additional Russian forces, pulling them away from other sectors of the front line. And as you said, holding territory inside Russia becomes a negotiation chip. I also wouldn't negate the potential political impact of fighting inside Russia, which is, on the one hand, an insane pressure on the Russian regime, right? So as a I guess, more propaganda warfare element inside Russia, the fact that the war is on Russian territory is a big shift. In addition to that, it also means that the whole discussion that Ukraine has been having with its Western partners about the use of Western weaponry on Russian territory continues to shift. The U.S. continues to hold back on using the ATACMS for strategic strikes deep inside Russia, but at this point, it's already been normalized that systems like the HIMARS, the artillery systems that everyone is delivering, that those are being used inside Russian territories. And who would have thought a year ago that we'd see a point where British Challenger tanks and German Leopard tanks would be rolling into Russian territory, right? It's kind of an insane shift in optics and in the starting point of that discussion, because now when you start to have that discussion, it's no longer about, well, you can do it in self-defense, etc. The situation isn't that murky anymore. It's very clear. We're inside Russia. We are advancing, and we have this weaponry. So I think that just starts to make things a little bit clearer. The West will continue to draw lines on, where they are comfortable with Ukraine using certain types of weaponry, because they'll still be scared of some kind of retaliation from Russia. But yeah, so with all of those things combined, there's just a whole lot of potential benefit from an operation like this, and then especially with it being conducted so well. Because if you think back of the first few days, or even the days before the actual incursion started, we saw those very coordinated drone strikes against multiple airfields, Russian airfields in the area of this battlefield. We saw a number of HIMARS strikes constantly hammering Russian convoys trying to bring in reinforcements. So, that's something that we've talked about in the past, where one of the big challenges that the Ukrainians seem to face is how to make the best use of all of those things that they are being given by the West. How do they actually coordinate all of those separate weapon systems and capabilities into an actual warfighting system? And to me, and I don't want to celebrate prematurely here, but to me, this offensive seems to indicate that at least some parts of the Ukrainian army are able to actually do that. And they've shown that in this operation, where they've actually coordinated the deep strike capability with the reconnaissance capabilities, and then followed it up with the actual ground forces. And it provides results.
Yeah, you're making me imagine a far-off future where Ukraine is in the EU and it's Ukrainian generals who are training all the other European countries in modern warfare, because they're the only ones that have actually fought it continuously. But that's a daydream.
I mean, I'm not sure if it'll go that far, but at least, Ukraine, and I think I've used those words before on your podcast, or I've used them elsewhere anyway, but Ukraine is the NATO center of excellence in fighting Russia, right? Mm-hmm. So that's, there's, whether it's Ukraine teaching people, or whether it's people looking at Ukraine or going to Ukraine to learn, that is definitely happening and will continue to happen.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about the strategic objectives. Tactically, I'm curious what you think happens next, because to me it seems there are three scenarios, and tell me if I've got them all or if I'm missing something. They can continue to push. Maybe they have some predetermined endpoint in mind, but they can continue on the offensive until they reach wherever they think is defensible. They could pull back to more defensible positions, or they could pull all the way back and say, okay, we've made our point, but we're not going to hang out here sort of exposed to the full weight of the Russian military, because eventually you've got to imagine that Russia will move its resources over there and will try and expel them. Where do you think we go tactically over the next couple of weeks with this?
So I think that Ukraine will continue to push, and I think they have to keep pushing for exactly the reason that you mentioned. Eventually, Russia will bring those forces to bear on this incursion, once they actually get their stuff together and manage to move it there. Ukraine needs to keep the pressure on until that actually happens. Otherwise, they're not really causing a lot of benefit for the rest of the front line through this operation. Now, in doing so, however, they do have to be very careful that they're not overextending. If they start to overextend and positions start to collapse and they have to withdraw, the whole symbolic value of this operation and the potential impact on the rest of the front line completely washes away, right? So I'm hoping that the Ukrainian commanders, as they seem to have very intelligently started off this mission, that they continue to be very intelligent in looking at what are the actual limits of the forces that we have in this area, and that they make the decision at the right time to start digging in, which is something that Ukraine also hasn't always been super effective in, where, even on many parts of the front line, they will establish their main defensive line, but they don't necessarily have fallback lines that allow them to actually pull back and quickly recover. So, if they want this to be a lasting impact on the conflict, I think they'll have to be smart about all of that. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong here, but I think at least for the time being, Ukraine has some potential to keep exploiting this, and they just need to be choosing the right time to transition from that opportunistic momentum into solidifying what they've gained.
Yeah, and this goes to the question of Ukraine's military leadership, which again, I'm struck by how much of the reporting here has been off, and I mean that's to be expected when it comes to a war. But from everything from Nord Stream to Zelensky's position to the counteroffensive to specifically the current commander of Ukraine's armed forces, because I remember in February when Zaluzhny was relieved. And the general conversation was, oh my God, like Zaluzhny is the architect of everything and he's clashing with Zelensky. And this is the beginning of the end of Ukraine's armed forces. And now we have this guy, Alexander Syrsky, I think is how you pronounce his name, who he's the architect behind this battle plan and seems to have gone very well. Do you have respect for his capabilities? Do you have some faith in his ability to do this?
Well, I don't know that Syrsky is the architect of this particular operation,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's that's question one. Who is the real brain, or are the brains behind this operation? That's one question. Another thing, of course, if you're comparing this with a lot of other prior operations, and the Nord Stream case, a lot of those kind of operations are linked to GUR and SBU, which have taken a bit more of a risky approach, and I think we're seeing a different approach from the regular army here in this operation as well. But whether it's Syrsky, whether it's someone else, the fact is that they have people that are able to be effective, and hopefully Syrsky and others in Kiev will take note and allow these people the influence that they require to spread that approach to other parts of the Ukrainian military, or to have other people in the Ukrainian military act in similar ways.
Fair enough. All right, well, let's move to the third part of our conversation, which is what happens next. Do you think this is ultimately a success for Ukraine? And one part of this question is I wanted to ask you if we think of the intensity of the war as sort of a dial from 1 to 10, with 10 being Russia's initial invasion and 1 maybe being the lulls and the doldrums of the winter periods here. Where would you put that dial in terms of the intensity right now, and where do you think the conflict is going to go over the next 6 to 8 months? I have been particularly struck at how the world is obsessed with the Philippines bumping ships in the South China Sea with the Chinese, and the ongoing morass in the Middle East, and Venezuela's elections and everything else. And meanwhile, I mean, the Russia-Ukraine war, the biggest war in Europe since World War II, the intensity dial, at least from my point of view, seems to be ticking upwards. So where do we go next? And specifically, where do you think we go next in terms of intensity here over the next 6 months?
So I'm not actually expecting that much to change in terms of the general situation and intensity of the conflict, let's say in the next 6 months. I mean, especially as we're heading towards winter and everything. But the reality is that even if this Kursk operation succeeds in pulling Russian forces away from other parts of the front line, and that opens up gaps for Ukraine to try and exploit, I don't think we'll see a sudden collapse of the Russian positions where Ukraine suddenly takes back the entire Kherson region, or gets back to Mariupol or something like that in the next few months, right? I highly doubt that. I think there are opportunities, or there might be opportunities for some advances on the front lines, and I hope there are. But realistically, this situation could go on for quite a bit. And what we're seeing in Kursk, it might simply be limited to an exploitation of an area that had not been involved yet in the conflict. But unless an incursion into Russia can actually get to strategically critical areas of Russia, I don't think that they would have a very significant effect in terms of changing the dynamics of the conflict. And when we're talking about strategically critical areas of Russia, I'm sure that you've studied the geography of Russia as well back when we were at Stratfor, and that those areas are simply quite a bit removed from this part of Russia. None of the natural gas fields, none of the main population centers are anywhere near where the fighting is going on. So in that regard, I think that at a tactical level, things can change for the better of the Ukrainians, but I think at a strategic level, we're not necessarily seeing a shift in how this conflict is being conducted or how it will be conducted. If there is a significant effect from it, it might be more likely to come from the effects that this has on Moscow. But then again, the level of importance of that region of Kursk might limit the intensity of those effects as well.
I'm going to ask you an impossible question, and I'm telling you now, I know it's impossible to answer, and that you probably have scenario trees for this. But where are we in 3 years from now on your scenario tree? Is it this kind of grinding, frozen conflict, and the two sides are going to be hitting at each other opportunistically, trying to outlast the other? I know, like, for example, you could have a Moscow political collapse scenario in your back pocket. Probably not likely, but it's there. You could have the same thing for Ukraine. But if you're somebody who's thinking about, I don't know, like grain trade over the next 3 to 5 years, or something that gets tangibly affected by the things that we're talking about, or shipping in the Black Sea, like where do you say the most likely scenario is for where we're going to be 3 years from now? Because we've reached this kind of disturbing point where it just feels like this is the normal, and is it just going to be like this for 3 years? Can either side last for another 3 years? Like it doesn't feel sustainable in that way, but at the same time, that's where my brain wants to go. So help me get through the fog there.
So, respecting that is an impossible question, I'm going to try to give an answer in the form of, I think I know what's not going to happen or what's not going to be the case in the next 3 years. And that's exactly things being like they are now. So I think it's very unlikely that this kind of fighting at this intensity could be sustained for another 3 years, and it could go many different ways. Can Ukraine continue to fight? Maybe there's a disruption in Western support. Maybe they do eventually run out of people to recruit into the armed forces. 3 years is a very long time to continue the kind of operations that they have been conducting so far. On the other hand, if Ukraine can continue for another 3 years at this level of intensity, I am not sure that Russia can actually sustain this for another 3 years. So I feel like regardless of what happens, I would think that 3 years from now we'll be in a very different situation, but I don't know what that situation looks like at all.
Fair enough. Before I let you go, I want to. You're obviously in Belgium. You're European yourself, and this is less in your bailiwick. So I know it'll make you squirm in your chair, but that's fun for me. What is, from your point of view, and obviously it's limited to just you, but what is your point of view about European sentiment towards Ukraine? Do you feel like Europeans are looking at the Nord Stream, pipeline stories and being like, "Good job, Ukraine," or "Hey, you guys blew up the gas infrastructure. We didn't tell you to do that"? Do you think they're looking at the offensive, rooting for Ukraine's success, or saying, "Hey, like I thought this was a defensive war. Why are you going into Russian territory?" What is your feeling about how sort of the normal level European is thinking about supporting Ukraine here for what looks like a war that's going to last for a lot longer than either side maybe thought at the beginning?
Obviously, I've got a significant range restriction in terms of, the people that I talk to, the people I happen to be surrounded with. And I have to say, I don't think I've actually heard anyone speak negatively about Ukraine being behind the Nord Stream 2 bombing. If anything, I think many of the people I talk to will agree, like, well, Germany should have done that anyway. So I don't know about that. I don't talk to a lot of Germans these days, so I can't tell you how they are feeling about it. That might be a more interesting question. But in general terms, I mean, I think perhaps the biggest observation is that despite all of these notable stories coming out, like, the additional information about Nord Stream 2, like the operation in Kursk, is that the general public's awareness or interest in what's happening in Ukraine has continued to slowly dwindle, as you would expect, of course, as things continue over a long period of time. Policymakers and interest groups, etc., they're obviously still very engaged with the issue, and it appears that they are still very committed to providing support to Ukraine. So I haven't necessarily seen any hints of changes of abandoning the course of their policy towards Ukraine. But yeah, that's as much as I can guess from the crowd that I hang with, I guess.
And then sort of going more into your professional toolkit, which is, and this is why I wanted to bring up the Nord Stream bombing in particular. I mean, I don't know if you felt this way at the time, but again, I feel like the mainstream narrative was, oh, this was a very complex operation. It was very sophisticated. It took incredible skill to pull off something like this. And if the reporting is true, it took a couple of trained divers and an ability to rent a yacht and to find your way sort of in the North Sea somewhere. And obviously, we talk a lot about Russia and Ukraine Baltic Sea. And obviously you talk about if it was the North Sea, things would be getting really interesting.
This shows you couldn't have pulled it off.
Yes, I don't think any Ukrainian commanders were coming to me to pilot this expedition. You'd quickly end up in the wrong place and declaring war on Scotland, of all things. I do feel like maybe it opens Pandora's box, and we've seen this twice this year. We saw the Houthis go after submarine cable infrastructure in the Red Sea, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa are still dealing with the internet performance issues because of the cutting and damage to a lot of those cables. We've now got a story about these Ukrainian divers going after a critical piece of state infrastructure for Germany. Is this the new norm? Do you think other countries or other groups are going to get these ideas? Because there are so many targets like this, whether it's data centers or submarine cables or more gas pipeline infrastructure. It feels to me like this opens up a really dark sort of place where critical infrastructure becomes targeted by both national actors and subnational actors in the context of all this geopolitical competition. Maybe that's always been happening anyway, but I just, do you feel like that threat is elevated? Are there places in the world where you are, or types of infrastructure we haven't talked about that you're particularly concerned about?
I think we need to be a little bit critical about the Nord Stream story and what that's telling us about national or subnational actor capabilities as well. Where the story now after this Wall Street Journal article seems to imply this were some drunk guys in a bar that decided, hey, what would be fun to do tonight? Let's go blow up Nord Stream 2. And I'm confident that this plan started at some point at a bar with some drunken people, but as soon as they had that idea and that conversation, I'm sure that the machinery of the state or the security organization started turning to collect intelligence. Where are the pipelines? How are the pipelines constructed? How deep are the pipelines? What capabilities do we need? Which people do we have with those capabilities? How do we get them there? How do we get the equipment, the explosives there? And this is quickly piling up to a lot of work beyond just a drunken night, right? Mm-hmm. And, there's also still a couple inconsistencies in the story with, for example, the Nord Stream pipeline is buried in layers of rock. So to place explosive effectively on the pipeline, you need to remove some very heavy rocks or have some insane amount of explosives, I guess. But either way, it requires a lot of work to be conducted underwater, which is not just a diver in a boat, even a very trained diver in a boat going to do that. You're likely having multiple people going down and relieving each other. Wow, that sounded very wrong as I said that. Sorry.
Oh, that's fine.
But but you would have had multiple people engaged as a team to actually conduct that operation, I think. So that being said, I think there's a little more to it than a drunken night. But even then, if we're talking about the capabilities of the Ukrainian military blowing up a pipeline, we've seen for years and years MEND and other Nigerian groups blow up pipelines in Nigeria. An underwater pipeline might be a little more complex, but it's not like the risk to pipelines or pipeline infrastructure is very new, right? Undersea cables, I guess we've considered them safe, apart from Russian submarines that we were constantly talking about their intent to cut undersea cables and all that. The Houthis might be able to present as a sustained threat there, but we also shouldn't forget that the Houthis are a quasi-state actor with support from states like Iran, which themselves have, of course, their support from Russia, China, etc. So it's not like they're, it's a bunch of farmers deciding to take out an undersea cable. There are significant resources and means going into these kinds of operations. And when it comes to undersea cables, let's also not forget the incident in the Baltic Sea, I think last year, when a Chinese vessel just forgot to pull up its anchor, dragged it along the surface of the Baltic Sea for a while and cut a couple of cables. Even by accident, you can cut these undersea cables. So that already shows that it doesn't necessarily take all that much of a reserved capability to be able to do that.
Yeah, I just wonder if it opens up a door to something like, Russia can say now, okay, there's proof that Ukraine was behind the destruction of this pipeline. So now if we hack some kind of, critical infrastructure in the United States, or if we hack some kind of infrastructure somewhere else, like, okay, like we're just responding to that sort of thing. Or if you're a group that is like the Houthis, if you're an ISIS style group that is trying to get a name for yourself, okay, maybe you go after something that disrupts shipping or disrupts communication or things like that. So it feels like it opens up a door to things that are disturbing. But I take your point that, in places that don't get the coverage, like Nigeria, this stuff happens all the time. So maybe I'm just Johnny come lately to the party.
I think one of the factors to keep in mind there is that it's not just about the capability to do this. It's also about the potential for retaliation, depending on the scope of that target. So taking out a pipeline in Nigeria, it's kind of a cost of doing business for the companies that operate there. The rest of the world doesn't really care all that much. But when we're talking about undersea cables that are connecting Europe, Asia, Africa, suddenly there's a lot of stakeholders that care and that will be willing to retaliate when you conduct an operation like that. Same with Nord Stream, when you harm infrastructure that actually supports the energy system of continents, people are going to care a little more. They'll care a little less if you're on their side, apparently, but they'll still care.
All right. Well, Sim, thank you as always for making time. I'm sure that we will have you back soon. Where can the listeners find you if they want to learn more?
You can look out for me on Twitter at SimTac. Yeah, that's where I'm at. Sorry, no Instagram or anything.
Oh, a simple man. So. You can also find him at a bar in Ghent talking about what critical infrastructure is going to blow up next. All right. Thanks, Sim.
That's not what I do. I do want to distance myself from that statement.
I'll show you. Don't worry. They know it's jokes. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.